Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our forums are most Sundays at noon for an hour, and they are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our mission is to nurture the mind and spirit and serve social justice. For more information about our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today I'm very honored and happy, and I think we all are, to welcome Dr. Steven Weinberg. He is a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he will be talking about reliable scientific knowledge and what we dream about. I'm going to briefly try to mention all of Dr. Weinberg's accomplishments and honors. This probably barely scratches the surface. He holds the Josie Regental Chair in Science at the University of Texas at Austin, and he is a member of the faculty of the Physics and Astronomy departments. His research on elementary particles and cosmology has been honored with numerous awards, including the 1979 Nobel Prize in Physics, and in 1991 he won the National Medal of Science. In 2004, he received the Benjamin Franklin Medal of the American Philosophical Society with a citation that said he is considered by many to be the preeminent theoretical physicist alive in the world today. He's been elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and Britain's Royal Society, as well as to the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's authored many books and articles. He served as a consultant at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, president of the Philosophical Society of Texas, and a member of the board of editors of Daedalus magazine, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, the Jason Group of Defense Consultants, and many other boards and committees. He was educated at Cornell, Copenhagen, and Princeton. He holds honorary degrees from 16 other universities, which I won't mention all of them. He has taught at Columbia, Berkeley, MIT, Harvard, where he was the Higgins Professor of Physics before he came to Austin in 1982, and we're so lucky to have him here. Let's give Dr. Weinberg a warm welcome. Dr. Weinberg.
Thank you, Bonnie. I hope it won't disappoint anyone. My talk today will not be about guns. As the title indicates, my talk is actually instigated by a remark that was made by a member of my book group about a month ago. I belong to this book group. It's about 25 years old, and for me it serves a wonderful function of forcing me to read recent fiction. Given my preferences, otherwise I would probably only read history and fiction no later than Edith Wharton. But we read a mixture of things, and this time we were meeting to discuss a novel called Euphoria. It's set in New Guinea, and it deals with a number of anthropologists who are actually intended to represent famous figures like Margaret Mead. At one point in the book, one of the anthropologists is looking forward to what will happen when they leave New Guinea and a new team of anthropologists comes in, and she, the anthropologist thinking about this, said, they'll probably have an entirely different view of these tribes that we've been studying, and they're going to write it up, and it will be as if they were different people that they were writing about, and that's the way anthropology goes. And a friend who's a member of the book group, actually a philosopher, said, yes, that's the way science is. It's always rediscovering. It's always changing its point of view. Nothing is ever permanent. I hit the ceiling. That may be true of anthropology. I don't know enough to judge that. But I really don't think it's true of the kind of science I do, the so-called exact sciences, physics, chemistry, astronomy, where I think we really do gain permanent, reliable knowledge. And indeed, what would be the point of it otherwise? It may be that, and I don't say this as something I necessarily believe, but it's possible that anthropology is a little bit like novel writing, and its value is literary. Each anthropologist studying a tribe will create a world the way a fiction writer creates a world, and the fact that the next anthropologist creates a different world in his or her writing is not bad. But that's not what we're doing. I mean, for one thing, the papers we write in physics have no literary merit. And there is no point to what we're doing unless we are gradually assembling a structure of reliable, permanent knowledge. And I claim we are. My own work has to do with primarily has to do with the physics of elementary particles. And in the years from the 1960s until, well into the 1970s, we developed a theory of elementary particles and their interactions called the Standard Model. I'm not going to go into too much details. The Standard Model is a theory of particles called quarks. The quarks, there are two kinds of quarks that make up the particles, the protons and neutrons, inside all atomic nuclei. And then there are four other types of quark that have heavier and unstable and don't appear in ordinary affairs, but are created in the laboratory. Along with the 6 types of quarks, there are 6 types of particles called leptons, of which the most familiar and famous is the electron. And the electron has 2 heavier siblings, which are unstable. And in addition, for every one of these 3, there is a electrically neutral, almost massless elementary particle called a neutrino. Then there are particles that produce the forces that connect these quarks and leptons when they interact. The most familiar of these force-carrying particles is the photon, the particle of light, and there are 3 others which carry a different kind of force than electromagnetism, a force called the weak interaction that produces radioactivity and also provides the first step in the chain of reactions that gives heat to the sun. And finally, there is, for many years, it was only a prediction of the Standard Model. There is a particle that's connected with the breakdown of the symmetries of the particles and forces that would otherwise produce a very simple picture in which all the quarks and leptons were 0 mass, and in fact, almost everything would have 0 mass. This particle is predicted by the Standard Model. It's called the Higgs boson. All of its properties are predicted except for its mass, and so we didn't know how much energy you needed to produce it, according to Einstein's E equals mc squared. And finally, it was discovered in 1982 with just the properties that were predicted. the standard model goes on being confirmed in our laboratories almost to the point where we're getting desperate for something new that goes beyond the standard model. And I'll come back to that. But by any standard, it represents reliable knowledge. It's not going to go away. And indeed, I wouldn't value my own participation in constructing the standard model if that weren't true, if it was just one literary description of the world which might be replaced by an entirely different literary description. So why is it that my friend in our book group made this remark that science is always changing its mind and no scientific knowledge is permanent anymore in physics? Well, he didn't say it in so many words, but the implication was no more in physics than in anthropology. I think there are a number of reasons for this, some of them quite friendly to science and some of them rather unfriendly. On the friendly side, there is the heroic myth. That is, that each great scientific advance comes through a lonely scientist challenging the accepted wisdom of his time, as did, for example, Galileo, maintaining the motion of the earth around the sun in the face of the teaching of the church and suffering house arrest for the rest of his life as a result and being forced to take it back. A geologist named Wegener, much more recently in the 20th century, advancing the idea of continental drift, that the Earth's surface is broken into plates which move around, generally disagreed with and regarded as almost ridiculous in his time, but has become an accepted part of geology. Or in the 19th century, Semmelweis bravely proclaiming that it is essential in treating disease to maintain antiseptic conditions, and that in particular in surgery, many of the bad results in surgery occur because antisepsis was not retained. There's a lot of truth in the heroic myth. I mean, what I've just said about Semmelweis and Wegener and Galileo is certainly not incorrect. However, what has happened over the centuries is a gradual professionalization of science, to the point where new ideas are much more rationally assessed, at least if they come from within the scientific establishment. For example, Einstein in 1905, his wonder year, made a number of really revolutionary proposals. There was the theory of relativity, which said that as you move rapidly, if a clock is moving close to the speed of light, it slows down. He had a theory of light, that it consists of little bundles of energy momentum, which later were called photons. Einstein at that time was a clerk in the patent office, the Swiss patent office in Bern, outside the establishment. But even so, the importance of his work was recognized by the establishment very rapidly. He himself wrote up his work in the standard journals of physics of the time, Annalen der Physik. It was written as the kind of scientific article that would be recognized. And very soon he was relieved from his work as a patent clerk and became a professor, if I remember correctly, first at Leipzig, but eventually, within a decade, winding up at the most prestigious university in Germany at Berlin. My own contribution to the standard model, one of them, but the one that's best known, was made in 1967. And at that time, I speculated about what I had done, and I said it would meet a certain mathematical condition, but I couldn't prove it. When the proof came, it was done by a Dutch graduate student that no one, including me, had ever heard of, but he published it in a well-known scientific journal, and we immediately recognized that he had gotten the right answer. He had proved what I and one other physicist who did the same thing about the same time had speculated. So the heroic myth, although true at times, is increasingly irrelevant to the way science is actually done. The establishment actually works. There's another reason for skepticism about the permanence of scientific knowledge that's less high-minded from people who have axes to grind. For example, the climate skeptics. I mean, there is a general consensus that the Earth is warming, and there's no doubt that human industrial processes add gases to the atmosphere that can cause this effect. Whether some part of it is natural and not related to human activity is still questioned, but that human beings are contributing to climate warming is not considered to be in doubt by the establishment. And yet there are politicians who, particularly from coal-producing states, who regard this as just one opinion among many. In the same sense, there are people, members of conservative religious denominations, who are appalled at the idea that human beings are what they are because of millions of years of random mutations, which are then selected by natural selection, by competition for food and mates. This picture of how human beings got to be the way they are, some people find deeply offensive, and so they offer an alternative called creation science. And this comes in various versions. Some creation scientists believe literally in the 6,000 years approximately of the Bible and argue that the dinosaurs whose bones we find were contemporaries of Abraham and Noah and so on. Others admit the great age of the earth, but they still feel that you can't account for the evolution for the development of human beings without divine intervention. Again, science can't rule out divine intervention. All we can say is that if God has been intervening in evolution, he's done a very good job of hiding his hand. And creation science is simply not science at all. It doesn't operate by the methods of science, and it can't be taken seriously. There's another school of thought that argues for the impermanence of scientific knowledge, which is much more intellectual and has found a home in the academy among sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, and some historians. They insist on viewing science as a social phenomenon. Well, it surely is. I mean, and in fact, I think there have been some good books written treating the scientific community through the methods of sociology or anthropology. I remember a book published by Harvard Press some years ago called Beam Times and Lifetimes, which treated high-energy physicists and their work at large accelerators as if they were a tribe in New Guinea. And they talked about, the book, for example, talked about the rigid code of informal dress. but where they go to, where they, and I enjoyed it. In fact, I recommended to Harvard Press that they publish it. But where they go wrong is to imagine that not only the human interactions of scientists can be described like any other human interactions, but that the product is an expression of the social environment, that Newton's laws are what they are, for example, because of the nature of 17th century English society. And one feminist historian of science has found in Newton's laws a profound anti-female bias. I find this nonsense, but it has been influential. There was a school called the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge. They use the SSK abbreviation, headed by a man named Harry Collins at the University of Bath in England, that didn't quite go this far, but they took the attitude that in judging the science of the past, we must put aside everything we know today about the laws of nature or the facts of nature, and we must immerse ourselves in the past, seeing the world as they saw it, not as we see it. Well, there is some value to that. I mean, if you really want to understand the mentality of Newton and his colleagues in the Royal Society, you do have to imagine yourself in a world where they never heard of relativity or quarks or leptons. But in understanding what Newton and the others did, you have to understand that they were right. And, for example, René Descartes, who had a completely different theory of the solar system, in which there's material with vortices and the planets are carried around on these vortices, you have to understand that that was wrong. This issue comes up with what is sometimes called the Whig interpretation of science. Whig, I mean W-H-I-G. It's a name taken from a British political party, which eventually became the Liberal Party. And a historian, Herbert Butterfield, as a young man in 1931, wrote a book called The Whig Interpretation of History, in which he, it wasn't about the history of science, it was about political and religious history, in which he argued against judging the past by the standards of the present. And his argument was extremely influential. A colleague of mine at the University of Texas remembers how he's a historian of science, and he remembers that when he was a graduate student in the 1980s, any article you wrote about the history of science could not mention present scientific knowledge. You had to, and that meant you also couldn't write programmatic history that relates what happened in the past to what's happening now. You had to write little limited things like the influence of family connections in the Royal Society in 1690 or something like that. We still argue about the Whig interpretation of history, and in fact, in the next issue of the New York Review of Books, this argument continues in an exchange of letters between me and another person, in which I continue to take a Whiggish point of view. But the question there is really not so much what will happen in the future to scientific knowledge as the way to look at the past. But those who want to look at the past entirely in its own terms are siding with the idea that scientific knowledge is impermanent and unreliable. And I think the most famous person who takes this point of view is the late Thomas Kuhn. In his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he describes how each period of normal science develops a consensus which is then completely blasted by the next scientific revolution, to the extent that the next generation of scientists doing what they regard as normal science can no longer understand what went before. Well, I think this is just quite wrong, and I've argued with him in print and in person. In fact, I would argue that I would go out on a limb and say that at least since the middle of the 19th century, no theory in the exact sciences, chemistry, physics, astronomy, that has become accepted by the consensus of professionals in the field has ever turned out to be wrong. Now, you have to be careful what I mean by wrong. Every theory, in a sense, is wrong because every theory is only an approximation. For example, Newton's theory of gravity and motion does a wonderful job of accounting for the motion of things like planets that are not moving near the speed of light and in gravitational fields that are relatively weak, nothing like the gravitational field outside a black hole. And it was proposed in 1915 by Einstein that this is just an approximation to a deeper theory, his own theory of gravity and motion, called the general theory of relativity. And then that, in the next decade or so, was verified by a number of experiments and observations. The Times of London had a headline when one of these observations was made, the observation of the bending of light as it passed close to the sun, light from a distant star. The headline in the Times of London was, "Newton proved wrong." Well, Newton wasn't proved wrong, and just the opposite, I think. It was discovered that what Newton had done was an approximation to the truth, and Einstein's theory not only didn't disprove Newton's, it explained why Einstein's theory works when it does work, as it does work in the solar system. Einstein's theory explained why Newton's theory works when it does work. After Newton's death, some decades later, the poet Pope had a wonderful quatrain about Newton, describing what Newton had done. "Nature and nature's laws hid all in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and there was light." And then in the 20th century, after Einstein's work, a comic poet named Squires wrote an addendum to that saying, "It did not last. The devil, crying ho, said, 'Let Einstein be,' and restored the status quo." Well, don't believe it. Einstein's theory is very much in the mold of Newton's theory. It's a set of mathematical equations incorporating some basic principles, which is then tested by experiment and observation. As I say in something I wrote recently, the difference between Newton and Einstein is much less than the difference between Newton and anything that went before him. I also put this another way, that if you put well, let's say today, if you put Einstein's equations of general relativity on a T-shirt, I don't expect that those equations will always be regarded as literally true. They will, in fact, I think we already have come to think of them as an approximation. But you don't have to throw away the T-shirt. So what is established now? Well, we have, at the deepest level that we have any knowledge of the world, there is a general, I wouldn't even say it's a scientific theory, it's more of a framework for scientific theories known as quantum mechanics. It's extremely counterintuitive. It was very difficult to develop. It was developed in the 1920s. And all successful theories, including the Standard Model, have been within the framework of quantum mechanics. The quantities that appear in these equations, which have names like wave functions and operators and so on, they're all given meaning within the framework of quantum mechanics. We also have a symmetry principle that the laws of nature look the same to various observers. It doesn't matter how you orient your laboratory. Aristotle was wrong. There's no fundamental difference between up and down or horizontal directions. The world, of course, is not symmetric, but the laws of nature are. And the symmetry goes beyond just changing the orientation of your laboratory. You can move your laboratory, and this was the contribution of Einstein in 1905. Different laboratories traveling at constant speed relative to each other all observe the same laws of nature. In particular, they all observe the speed of light, the same speed of light. One of the things that makes the Standard Model attractive is that a good deal of its structure is dictated by the quantum mechanics and special relativity. In other words, it's not just a slapdash thing that we put together to make it agree with experiment. It is, to some extent. If we didn't do experiment, we wouldn't know about the existence of quarks. But, for example, it would violate, in ways I don't want to go into, it would violate the principles of quantum mechanics if you had a different number of quarks and leptons. That's something that's forced on you. And I think this is what physicists mean when they talk about beautiful theories, that the structure of the theory is not arbitrary. It's not a kludge that's been adjusted to agree with observation. It's dictated by fundamental principles. That's never entirely true, but to the extent that it is true of the Standard Model, we find it a beautiful theory. The same, to some extent, is true of Einstein's theory of gravity and motion, which is gravity is left out of the Standard Model. Einstein was very proud that he could derive the structure of his theory, the details of the equations, from fundamental principles, in particular the principle that there's no fundamental difference between gravity and inertia. That is, that the force you feel when you're in a car that suddenly stops is not intrinsically different from the force you feel when you're attracted to the earth. And that's true, but not as to the extent that Einstein emphasized. He limited the structure of his equations by insisting they take a certain simple form, which was not dictated by any fundamental principle. And we now know that brings his equations into conflict with quantum mechanics in such a way that we have come to think in recent years that Einstein's general relativity theory is itself just an approximation to a more complicated theory in which the equations don't take such a simple form. And the same is true, incidentally, of the Standard Model. The equations of the Standard Model were chosen to have a simple form, and it isn't in conflict with quantum mechanics, but we still think that those equations are only approximate. And in fact, we have evidence of that now. The Standard Model, in its simplest version, would require the neutrinos to be strictly massless. They are very light. The mass of the heaviest neutrino is probably about 1/1,000,000th the mass of the electron, which is, aside from neutrinos, the lightest elementary particle we know. And these are 1,000,000 times lighter. But the fact that they have any mass at all is a departure from the Standard Model. And we will eventually understand this departure. Among the exact sciences, I was careful to list astronomy. There was also what's called a Standard Model in astronomy. The universe is expanding in the sense that the galaxies are rushing apart from each other. The universe consists of, we now can study radiation left over from near the beginning of this Big Bang, and the Big Bang is now known to be 13.72 billion years old. And we can actually say this with a straight face, talking about an age of actually maybe 13.73 or 5 or 1, but it's 13.7 something billion years old. And that's just amazing that we can make a statement like that. Now, this combination of the Standard Model of elementary particles, the Standard Model of cosmology, and general relativity, that's the best we've been able to do so far. We know it's not the end of the story. We know that we have to put general relativity and the Standard Model of elementary particles into the same framework. We know we have to understand how the Big Bang got started, and there are all kinds of speculations about this. There is a speculation that's become very popular because it's been borne out by some observations called inflation in cosmology, that before the Big Bang, with the galaxies rushing apart, there was an even earlier period when the universe was essentially empty except for some fields that permeated the universe, and the universe expanded much more rapidly than it's expanding now. That's why it's called a period of inflation. And the little inhomogeneities that we observe in the microwave radiation background, which radio astronomers detect, and the big inhomogeneities like galaxies, are all the result of quantum fluctuations in this early period of inflation. That's not thoroughly established, but it's extremely promising. And then, as far as the deeper problems of the laws of nature, gravity and elementary particles, there is a highly speculative theory called string theory. In fact, it's not only speculative, but it doesn't really exist, in the sense that we don't have a set of equations that capture what string theory is. It's a variety of calculations that are done starting with the idea that elementary particles are just vibrating strings rather than points in space. And this idea turns out to have some extremely attractive features, and in particular, it makes necessary the existence of gravity. In this theory, you can prove that among the modes of oscillations of these strings, there is necessarily one that corresponds to the graviton, the particle which is the carrier of gravitational force. So it's an attractive theory, but has had no experimental successes. Why am I talking about these? Well, I wanted to make it clear that at any point at least in the history of the exact sciences, at least since the middle of the 19th century, there is a body of accepted knowledge, the consensus, which gradually expands and changes to the extent that what we think in 1 year, decades later, we find is only an approximation, but it's never wrong. The same way that you can't say Newton's theory was wrong, the standard model of elementary particles and the Big Bang theory of cosmology will never be discovered to be wrong, but we will learn more about them, and in particular, we will learn better why they are true, when they are true as good approximations, and what takes their place when they're not good approximations. Then there are speculations on the fringes of our science, which no one in their right mind would regard as well established. Speculations like inflation and string theory. And with the progress of time, become part of the accepted consensus. Our standards are very high. A theory does not become part of the accepted consensus until it's won an awful lot of battles in confrontation with observation and experiment. But when it does, it becomes reliable knowledge, and that is what we dream of. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. Okay. We have a question from Fred Higgins.
Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. I've listened to you for many hours, and I've read some of your books. But
I only talked for 1 hour here.
I know. You outdid yourself here. Philosophy, anthropology, exact science. But that begs the question. I think it's Stephen Hawking, the physicist, recently was quoted as saying that mankind has maybe 500 to 1,000 years left, and technology is probably going to be our demise. And I'm wondering how you relate that to the recent news that scientists have moved the doomsday clock to 3 minutes. Where are we in all this?
Well, that goes way past anything I talked about, but I'm happy to answer because it's something I've been concerned with. People talk about what are the challenges facing humanity, and climate change is obviously an important one. Terrorism is another. I think the biggest challenge facing humanity is the fact that although the Cold War is supposed to be over, we still have put it this way, the weapons don't know the Cold War is over. Russia and America in particular, and to some extent China, India, other countries, have nuclear arsenals which, if they were ever used, would very likely destroy civilization. And I'm not at all confident that the people who year after year boringly supervise these weapons are able to stay awake enough so that they can guarantee that they never will be used in some kind of misunderstanding. I'm not worried that Russia will suddenly decide to attack the United States because it would be insane and suicidal. But there have been occasions, several of them in the past, which are now well documented, when one side or the other thought the other had launched an attack. There's a famous example when a missile test was going on in the Norwegian Sea, and it appeared to the Russians that they were under attack, and they started their retaliatory countdown, which they then stopped, of course, before it reached the point of no return. But given the increasingly bad relations between Russia and America, I can see this happening again. No president has given high enough priority to reducing the number of nuclear weapons down to the point where, although we maintain some sort of deterrent, we're no longer threatening the survival of life on Earth. I think it's not a political issue. I don't think anyone has mentioned this in the run-up to the primaries. People just don't pay attention to this, but I think it's a very serious threat. I'm old enough so that, in a way, it doesn't matter too much to me, but I have a granddaughter, and I think the world is not a safe place for her. And I don't know what to do about it. I've written articles about it. Other people have, but the number of people, Senator Sam Nunn has been a leader in raising this issue, but it just doesn't have any traction with the public. It's much more important to discuss current issues I regard climate change as a very serious issue, but it's not going to destroy human civilization. The warming of the Earth may do a lot of damage, but we here in Austin will always remain above sea level. But we may not survive if there's a nuclear exchange.
We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a question from Gary Bennett.
Okay, I would like to have a minor challenge to your disclaimer that intellectual currents and whatnot of an era don't have a bearing on scientific discovery, at least in the exact sciences. And one of the cases that I have, Copernicus came up with a wonderful theory that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than vice versa, but there were two strikes against it that kept it from being widely adopted for a century. One was that it only removed one epicycle from the Ptolemaic theory, and the other was that unlike the Ptolemaic system, it didn't have any physics to back it up. And one of the reasons is that Copernicus and a number of other people like Kepler and so forth were all Neoplatonists. Plato really being about the only ancient figure of prestige that could compete with Aristotle. So it wasn't really till you got to Newton, well over a century after Copernicus, that you could really say that there was a physics to go with the heliocentric theory. I would like you to comment on that.
Well, I partly agree with you and partly disagree with you. It's certainly true that there was no observational evidence that for Copernicus over, say, the Ptolemaic theory with epicycles. Copernicus made a great advance in recognizing that a lot of the features of the Ptolemaic theory, which seemed arbitrary, like the fact that the center of the epicycle of Venus always remains on the line between the Earth and the Sun. Completely arbitrary assumption, but absolutely necessary to account for observation, turned out to be unnecessary once you adopt the heliocentric theory that the Earth goes around the Sun. Also, as had been known since Greek times, the Sun is a lot bigger than the Earth, and it seemed more natural for the Earth to go around the Sun than vice versa. But in the time of Copernicus, there was no observational evidence that his theory was right and Ptolemy was wrong. That came not with Newton, but with Galileo's observation of the phases of the planet Venus. He observed that Venus has phases like the phases of the moon. In fact, he wrote a coded message to Kepler saying the mother of loves, yes, the mother of loves emulates the shapes of Cynthia. The mother of loves is Venus, and Cynthia is the poetic term for the moon. So Venus has phases like the moon. This was the first thing that provided an experimental, an observational distinction between Ptolemy and Copernicus, which was on Copernicus' side. And it was discovered by Galileo. May have been the most important discovery he made, although he was already a convinced Copernican when he made this discovery. As far as physics is concerned, I think you're wrong, because you said that Ptolemy's theory had a physics background, whereas Copernicus didn't. In fact, neither did. Ptolemy's theory was not based on Aristotle's physics. It was in contradiction to Aristotle's physics. And in fact, there had been a debate between the followers of Ptolemy and the followers of Aristotle through the period of Arab science and well into the Middle Ages. And in as late as the early 16th century, you have people like, a philosopher, Fracastoro, saying, it's true, the Aristotelian theory of planets being carried on spheres, all rotating with the center of the Earth as the center, doesn't agree very well with observation, and Ptolemy's theory does. But Ptolemy's theory violates the physical ideas of Aristotle, because Aristotle thought the only motion possible above the orbit of the moon were circular motion with the Earth as a center. That was the basis of the Aristotelian theory of the solar system, and it was contradicted by the Ptolemaic theory. In fact, a lot of people talk as if there was somehow no distinction between Aristotle and Ptolemy. They were completely contradictory, and the followers of each had been fighting with each other for 2,000 years. But you're basically right that there was precious little evidence for Copernicus when his theory was first developed, and that came, although its beauty, its elegance, you said got rid of one epicycle. Well, getting rid of the fine-tuning, the careful adjustment of things that was necessary in Ptolemy's theory was sufficiently attractive to make Galileo and Kepler followers of Copernicus before the observation was made, well before Newton. And it even provided a method of calculation that was much simpler than the Ptolemaic. And in fact, when planetary tables were constructed that told you where each planet would be at any time in the past or future, where in the zodiac each planet would be, those tables, the so-called Prutenic tables, were constructed using the Copernican theory rather than the Ptolemaic, even though some of the people who used those tables continued to believe that the real truth was the Ptolemaic theory, but not the Aristotelian theory.
My understanding of the CERN experimentation is that they are trying to discover how the invisible universe becomes visible through the discovery of Higgs boson, how energy transforms to matter. I don't know, have we come close to understanding how nature transforms to energy to matter?
Well, I don't really recognize this as the discovery of the Higgs boson was an attempt to discover how particles get mass. It's not visible, I wouldn't use that word, it's how they become massive. And it was there was a mechanism suggested for this in 1964 by Higgs and 5 other physicists for how this is possible in general terms, without any specific theory. being proposed. And then it was made a part of a specific theory of the forces on elementary particles, which turned out to be part of the Standard Model by me and Abdus Salam. And that predicted this particle, the Higgs boson. There were alternatives involving new kinds of force, which I suggested as a possibility. Another physicist at Stanford, Lenny Susskind, suggested. And until the Higgs boson was discovered, it was an open question. What is the mechanism that gives mass to these particles? Although most of the predictions of the Standard Model don't depend on that, so that most of the success of the Standard Model didn't provide a clue. And then it was discovered that there is a Higgs boson. Right now, the Large Hadron Collider is going way beyond this. It is trying to discover entirely different particles that are predicted by much more speculative theories, in particular a theory called supersymmetry, which I am not an originator of, but is very attractive, and it may turn out to be verified by the discovery of new particles at the LHC. That's what they're dreaming of. Also, another thing they're dreaming of, astronomers tell us that only about a few percent, 4% of the mass of the, well, let me put it this way. If you just consider particles carrying mass, only about 1/6 of the mass of the universe is in the particles of the Standard Model. 5/6 is in some kind of particle that we have never observed in our laboratory. We only know about it because of its gravitational effects in galaxies and clusters of galaxies and in the expansion of the whole universe. We call it dark matter. And I think the fondest dream of the people working at the Large Hadron Collider is that they will discover particles of dark matter. The Higgs boson is now an old story.
Dr. Weinberg, thank you for